Okay, welcome back to this introduction to interpretation, part two. We're going to look at finding an appropriate range of interpretation with a little piece of prose by Jamaica Kincaid. All right, so "Girl" is the name of the story. This is a great opportunity to review how to apply the role of terms that you've probably already learned in the past, such as syntax. We know that sentence structure and diction and word choice; those two always go together. Come up on the AP exam over and over again. But syntax, we can look at this very formally with sentence classifications like complex, compound, complex, etc., imperative, declarative, and so forth. And if you can do that, great, but we don't have to. We can also look at it much more holistically with things like the length of the sentence, the use of the punctuation, the word order, and things like this. Syntax can tell us a lot about a character, their age, background, degree of formality, and stuff like that, almost like an accent. And so the other part of that accent would be diction, their word choice. And so when analyzing diction, you always try to give it a category or a descriptor, i.e. what kinds of words are being used here. And so, when you're doing your analysis, when you're doing your writing, you don't want to say, well, the author uses diction. Well, duh, it's kind of hard to write without words. Instead, you want to look at, okay, he uses sepulchral diction, words having to do with death, or arboreal diction, words having to do with trees. And I know what you're thinking. I don't have those fancy words. And I will probably tell you at some point during the year, like if you watch the college entrance essay advice, is don't use big words just for the sake of big words. Sometimes they fit, sometimes they don't. So if you don't have fancy words like that, that's okay. Use your own diction. You don't need to sound presumptuous or erudite. Just say nature imagery or words having to do with death. It's always good if you can use words that get more specific, which was what I was going for there. But don't stress out if you don't have those words. All right. At all costs, avoid empty or vague modifiers. You don't want to say things like extreme diction. Like, what does that even mean? Like I said, give it one of those other modifiers. How is this different than any other writing? All right. And of course, that creates our accent or our character. All right. Also, you have imagery. We know what that is. Language that appeals to the five senses. Remember, don't forget about that. People always think it's just what you see, but there are oral images as well. When analyzing imagery, always try to give it a category or descriptor, just like with diction. All right. You can start with the type of imagery, but that shouldn't be your end-all and be-all. It's even better if you can identify a specific association, like maybe it's floral imagery or melancholic imagery. And of course, the words we use on the other page all work well too. But again, you want to avoid those empty modifiers like vivid or extreme. And with each of these, we're looking at why the author made these choices, why these word choices, why we spend so much time on this specific type of imagery and stuff like that. And so when we're doing that, we want to try to avoid redundant and obvious statements like the imagery helps you see it better. Well, duh, isn't that the word image is in it? Like, what author doesn't want you to be able to see what they're talking about? Because what we really read when we see the imagery helps you see it better is, I don't know what to say. And that's okay. I hope you're not offended by that. But what we're working on here is, well, then how do we go further and find something to say? All right, enough of that tangent. Setting, another simple thing. It's just the time and place where something takes place. We often forget about that and think it's not that important, but that was a conscious decision on the part of the author too. And so, there can be a range. Like sometimes the text is just in the 19th century or 1950s. Sometimes it can be very, very specific. Like we'll read a play later on this year that takes place in the Hill District in Pittsburgh in 1957, like a very, very specific location and time. And there's a reason for that. An author might have a more generic or open-ended setting in order to make the point that this is like a universal or a common thing. In fact, in some like 19th century English novels, they would actually just put a blank, right, for the town name, like Blankshire and stuff like that, as a way of saying this is your town too. But other times we can have a very specific and even historical setting in order to make it very pointed, point. Geographic descriptions are really important, so we want to pay attention to the imagery in those descriptions and answer why the author chose that setting and chose that imagery and chose these things. They are choices. How do they contribute to meaning, message? And so be careful there. And a theme, sometimes we think, the theme is love, or the theme is hate, or the theme is civil rights. Like, those are subjects, they're not themes. We're looking for a message. What was the author trying to say about those subjects, about those things? And then we back up and say, okay, here's the imagery that supports that, here's the diction that supports that, and syntax, and so forth. All right, so I want you guys to take a minute and read through Girl by Jamaica Kincaid. That should be... I'll put it up on a slide here, but it'd probably be hard to read here. But I'll also put an attachment and a link on my website where you find this video. If you have a way of annotating it, great. Whether that means like printing it out and physically doing that, or just putting it on your computer, you can add annotations or something like that. That'd be great. At the end of the quarter, we'll review the work that you've done this quarter, the learning portfolio, how much you've learned, and that's something you might show me. If you can't do that, that's okay. But do read it and think about it, make these notations, look at syntax, diction, imagery, setting, maybe even point of view, and try to figure out all those things. Hit pause, read it, and come back when you're ready. All right, welcome back. So there's a lot going on in this not very big story. And even though the story is quite short, not very many words at all, it just is plopped on this page like there's this big, overwhelming mess. And that is, even the presentation of it like that, I think, is intentional. So starting with syntax. Some of you might have noticed that it's all one big sentence. Even when you have a sentence within it, it's followed by a semicolon to show it's not even its own sentence. It's just enmeshed in with all this other stuff, right? So you might have noticed that. You might have noticed that there's a lot of commands. Do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. And that sort of thing. And that's all part of sentence structure, right? And there's reasons for it. We want to show how confusing and overwhelming these might be to a young girl, the supposed audience here. And of course, the title helps us figure that one out. So the syntax definitely has quite an influence here. This long list of parallel clauses in one sentence, all these commands, some very, very serious, some kind of light and silly, like spitting, but they're all given very similar weight within this, and I think that's intentional as well. If you've ever talked to a kid or a middle schooler and they've tried to tell you a story, they're not very good at differentiating importance of detail, right? It's and then we went to the mall, and then we went into this, and then we went to this, oh my gosh, and then we went swimming, and then my dog died. It just, whoa. Can we maybe work on that a little bit? And so as adults, sometimes maybe we forget that kids don't always know which of our commands are super important, which are only kind of important. So that could be part of it. All right, so diction. You might have noticed that it doesn't tell you the setting, but you're going to need the diction to figure it out. It's fairly simple and straightforward, right? Leading right into all those commands and so forth. There might be some words that you're not familiar with. And so, sometimes they might give you a footnote with Bena being, cultural songs that you would never sing in Sunday school. Or some of the food that they're eating, right? Dukunya and stuff like that. You might have footnotes on that, or that might be something that you look up. It's going to help you figure out where it's happening. But chances are, there's one word that stuck out to you that you were like, whoa. And even though there are other words that are used more often, that one's given so much weight, and certainly has so much weight, that you can't help but be affected by it. You can't help but remember it. If you remember anything about the story, it's going to be that, right? And that's on purpose, all right? Because there's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy here. We see not only just that one word there, but we see then also presumably the speaker is a mother, her reactions to the child. At the end there, the child, for example, the girl, comes back with, "But what if the baker won't let me feel the bread?" In italics there. And the mother says, "You mean to say, after that, you are really going to be the kind of woman who the baker won't let near the bread?" Now that's a very probably innocent question on the part of the girl. And it might change a little bit depending on the age you interpret the girl to be. But if you've ever been like a kid and gone into a store, you're not treated the same as when you do as an adult. Like, they just snarl at you and yell at you. Like, you're not allowed to touch things. Like, it is, whereas, an adult, we walk in, we're going to be treated a little bit more respect. And kids are dirty, let's be honest. I have 2 of them, I know. Like, their hands, ugh, gross. Yeah, I don't want them on my bread. And maybe that's what she's getting at. But the mother, right, she loads all kinds of implication on that. And there's other places as well that she kind of sets up this self-fulfilling prophecy. Sometimes students will take this and say, well, maybe the mother is really talking about her own life. She's projecting here. Some people will take the point of view as being like a girl, not really a girl anymore, maybe, but a little older and reflecting back. Like maybe she's about to become a mother and reflecting back. That's not where I went initially, but I think that's smart. That's interesting, right? It's maybe. It's supportable by the text. Again, some more of the word choice and selection of detail, like wharf rat boys, and be careful about with the blackbirds, right? And there's kind of the superstition in there. That certainly is part of us figuring out the setting and what's going on here. All right, so there's, like I said, there's a lot more we can go into, but the imagery, again, looking up each of those things is going to be important. The songs, the contrast, the image of the father's khaki, and those sorts of things. Those two, some of you might stop and say, like, wait, this is really, really domestic imagery. She's really kind of gendering this girl. Like, kind of has this expectation of exactly what she's going to be, or do, or what her love life is going to be like, right? And that might help us to get into time period. It might help us also get into some of the message, right? This is part of what's overwhelming to this girl. These are not simple tasks when it comes down to it. And navigating this world is not simple, and it is contradictory, and we certainly have that throughout here. So that's another thing that you could go into. And again, we can say a lot more than what I have, but I'm trying to keep this fairly short. And of course, setting. Well, what did you come up with there? Given those details, the word choice, the imagery, the selection of the food, right? The wharf rat, the saltfish. We know that it's going to be somewhere near the ocean, likely an island. A lot of people say Jamaica because of the author's name, but it's I don't know that we can go quite that far, but it is most likely a Caribbean island. There's a lot of influence of colonialism that we see here. For example, with the contrast of singing those calypso songs, Benna, in Sunday school, is certainly reminiscent of that, even the father's clothes, perhaps. And perhaps the domestication and lack of much in technology will make us, think this is, maybe the first half of the 20th century. And that's where I place it. We know it was published in 1978, and it sounds like this narrator is not Jamaica Kincaid herself. We had to avoid that fallacy, but it sounds like her upbringing may have influenced this, and so it's probably before 1978 for sure. There's nothing futuristic about this. Could even be the 1800s, but I think that's going back a little bit too far. Again, we don't have a lot to say that's not that. All right, maybe the khakis and whatever. All right, so now we have to go into, well, I've made all these observations. I've come up with some cool stuff to say about all that overwhelming and run-on syntax and about the diction and the commands and about the imagery. All right, so let's put it all together to get at, like, what is the point of this? What is the message? All right, so when you're putting, I want you guys to take a minute and put together a thesis. What do you think it's about? and what is used to convey that. And so, oh, wait, come back. When we put together a thesis, this is just one way that we can do it. It's a good way to start. And then, as you get more comfortable with it, or as you revise your paper, you can make it a little bit more personal and flow better and stuff like that. But this is making sure we get all the elements that we need in there. So first, start with the genre, title, and author. Right, in the short story "Girl" by Jamaica Kincaid, boom, got it all out there. Then we need a verb, right? Uses what? Abrasive diction or parallelism, right? That's a syntax word. Run-on sentences, that's another syntax thing. Right? Contradictory commands, that's all in there. Gender roles, that's a selection of details. Stream of content, there's a lot of more stuff you can put in there, right? Domestic imagery and so forth. To show or to illustrate or to critique, well, what? How difficult it is to grow up as a young girl with all the clashing cultural and gender expectations put on you, the contradictory messages that young girls are given in society, maybe something about that self-fulfilling prophecy. Like the mother really kind of seems to think that the girl is going to become a you-know-what when she is older. All right, so hit pause, take a minute, and write out a thesis, and then come back when you're done. All right, so now I want to talk about what is an acceptable range of interpretation. So when we're interpreting texts, rather than having just a right and a wrong answer, there are many right answers and there's some wrong answers. There's a range of right answers. And we realize that this is the way that life often is. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're within that range. And remember that you have to prove your point. So if you're in the middle of that range, you're in the center, like just like a political spectrum or any other spectrum, you don't have a lot of explaining to do. Maybe you're boring, but it's easy to prove, right? But as you get farther and farther out on any sort of spectrum, a political spectrum, for example, to the left or the right, the more radical your ideas become, the more interesting they might be. The more people might listen to them just because they're crazy or whatever. But also, the more proof you need to convince people of them. All right, and so, we start in the middle, and if we can get out a little bit more, get a little bit more interesting, and still support it, that's great. All right, that's what we're looking for. Okay, so what's within that range, right? It's not about peanut butter sandwiches, so what is it about? Okay. So these are based on what students have written me in the past with that thesis thing there. Girl presents a social commentary on the impossible expectations and double standards placed on girls while simultaneously warning against self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, we definitely saw some of that in there. Pretty central, pretty safe, and very workable. Go for it. Girl profiles a mother who loves and wants to protect her daughter, but whose fears get in the way, ultimately overwhelming and exasperating the daughter. Getting a little more interesting because, given the title and all, we probably sympathize with the girl the most. And I think we're meant to, but we sometimes forget about the mother's motivations there too. She is trying to maybe protect her daughter and make sure that she's successful in that world. The mother too might just be like repeating what's been told to her, right? These things, they get ingrained and then you pass them down and then it's a cycle. It's hard to stop, right? And so trying to understand the mother's motivations, there might be something to that too. Girl presents the conflict and anxiety created by the imposition of European values onto established cultures through the seemingly simple but overwhelming and contradictory commands given to young girls. All right, now we're getting interesting. And so that's a little bit more nuanced. It maybe wasn't the central theme or idea of the entire text, but it was definitely in there. We definitely saw some of that contrast. And maybe some of that contradiction in commands and values is a result of that too. The whole thing about, making a tea or a medicine. You remember that part. But then not being a slut, like those seem kind of contradictory. Is that tea probably wasn't a missionary that taught him that, right? And so maybe that's part of the clash, right? The blackbird, versus the Sunday school and the calypso song, like there definitely is some cultural clash going on there. So that's interesting, right? It's more nuanced, and you're going to have to go find some more specific details maybe to convince me of it, but it's definitely within the range. Girl profiles the inner monologue of a young woman on the cusp of motherhood, recollecting the lessons of her caring but overbearing mother. Also very, very possible Usually because of the title and everything else, we go into like the age of that girl. But maybe it is looking back the fact that there's no tagged speech. In other words, there's no quotation marks in there. Even when the girl like talks back a little bit, or maybe talk back has the wrong connotation, but the mother probably thought I was talking back. What if the baker doesn't let me near the bread? That was in italics. It wasn't given in quotation marks. And so this does sound like it's an inner monologue. Perhaps it is that girl recreating all these commands. And thus, like we said, through the syntax, showing just how convoluted and confusing and mixed up and like hard to differentiate these things can become. And of course, there's always the smart arse in high school. Girl is about an alien trying to understand Caribbean culture through the impersonation of a young girl and the conclusion that girl feels as a result of this. Confusion, sorry. Yeah, you're out of the range. Out of the range, buddy. No. All right. A few more actual student theses without my meddling. The passage "Girl" by Jamaica. Now it is a short story, but that's okay. We make mistakes. By Jamaica Kincaid outlines the rigid framework that is set out for young girls in the past. It demonstrates how even the smallest, most trivial aspects of life must be done right in order to be the right kind of woman in the eyes of society. It is very similar to things that we said all along. The author, again, if you haven't established it yet in your introduction, do use that last name, Kincaid, uses the tension of a mother and daughter's dialogue to point out the overwhelming expectations of being a woman and the clashes of cultures in their society. This one's a little bit more problematic because it's not really a dialogue. The daughter maybe tries to make it one, but it's not. And maybe that's part of the point, that it's not a dialogue, and it needs to be. Girl by Jamaica Kincaid is a story about an early 20th century Caribbean girl feeling overwhelmed by the demanding and misogynistic expectations laid on her by her mother. Okay, so that one, it's leaning a little bit more towards summary, but they definitely got it, and they have a lot we can work with there, right? They understood what it was about, and so as we move forward in our analysis, try to find more of that nuance and interesting stuff, but workable. In the article, Girl, the author conveys the pressure that society puts on young girls. She does this by using short, straight-to-the-point clauses in a very long, overrun sentence. Okay, and now we're getting a little bit too simplistic, but there's still stuff to work with here. And I think that's important. You don't have to get everything about a passage, about a poem on the exam or a short story on the exam. Find your approach. Find the place where you can get in there, right? Talk about what you do know, and don't worry about what you don't. And so here, it's a short story, not an article, but it is, about this pressure. We want to say a little bit more about it, right? And even though they don't have the highfalutin language of English lit, right, straight to the point clauses or a long overrun sentence, that's okay. You're still right. And it's very possible this, sometimes we just gotta start writing, gotta get going. And we kind of stumble upon a more interesting idea later on, right? So hopefully this writer pushes towards something a little bit more sophisticated, but it is a start, and that is important. Work with what you can do and what you know. All right, well that's pretty much it for that. Even if we were in a class, we could definitely discuss this story a lot more and say a lot more about it. Hopefully you guys read it and were able to jot down some really interesting things in your annotations, and not only tracked with what I was saying, but also were able to add some observation and go beyond it. If not, don't worry, we're still doing more practice with this stuff. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.